All right, so this video is going to be basically everything you need to know about all 8 of the dungeons coming into Season 3 for 10.2 of Dragonflight. Obviously, this is going to try to be as quick as possible. I'm not necessarily going to go super in-depth on every single trash mob, every single boss, but these are like basically the overarching themes of what you need to know about the dungeons to kind of be successful, whether this be boss mechanics that might wipe you, trash that is non-trivial that can cause problems, or that kind of thing. Just like what the design of the dungeon is going to look like as a whole. We're also, maybe in certain situations, going to talk about pathing a little bit, but more often than not, these things are going to be developing as the season progresses. And I kind of expect to come back and hit these dungeons at some point and kind of talk about how players are really playing the dungeons, maybe on like a more meta level, as opposed to like the quick and dirty, what do you need to know to be able to jump into these keys. In addition to that, I'm going to be talking about and releasing tip videos on my YouTube page every single day, probably for like a month. Once the season starts for Mythic Plus tips, I suspect that these are going to be kind of like short videos. But yeah, without further ado, let's kind of talk about the dungeons themselves. And so for themes about the whole entire dungeons, for last season, for 10.1, for Season 2, the theme was you need a Mass Dispel. Right, and Mass Dispel was mandatory in a lot of dungeons and in a decent amount of specific instances. For this season, I will say that Poison and Curse Dispel is really nice in a lot of spots. I would say for about 5 out of 8 dungeons, it's nice. I think it's about required for DHT and very nice for Everbloom. But in general, though, having Poison and Curse Dispels are pretty nice. I think that there's like some instances where Purge is mandatory, like Throne of the Tides, but I think we're going to talk about that later. And Disease Dispel, Disease Dispel can be useful in some spots, but it's not like super important. So let's talk about all 8 dungeons, and we're going to start off with Blackrook Hold. So the beginning trash in Blackrook Hold can be a little bit tricky. Generally, moving mobs out of the Sacrifice Soul ground effect is going to be pretty good. The Ghostly Protectors actually take bonus damage whenever they're casting Sacrifice Soul, so you can either move the mobs out, you can kill the Ghostly Protectors, you can wait for them to finish casting Sacrifice Soul. There's a lot of ways that you can deal with this beginning area of trash. You do need to pull some of this trash. If you did this trash whenever it was current in Legion, you didn't have to pull it for count, but they reworked the count whenever Legion Time Walking happened. First boss, no real mechanics. If you're ranged, try to play a little bit further from the boss to dodge the Scythe. They make the Scythe one-shot players, so you want to probably be like somewhere between the 15 to 35 yard range whenever that Swirling Scythe is coming out. Basically, whenever the 50% intermission happens, you also try to kill the ads, but that's mostly how the first boss works. For the second boss, you need to make sure that you're spread for the glaive, and if you get the Dark Rush mechanic on you, you try to place those rush puddles in like a pretty good spot. This is going to allow you significantly less area denial, and whenever the boss phase is in the intermission, you're going to be able to drag that beam into better locations because you place that Dark Rush there. But more often than not, you just want to stay spread for the glaive whenever it's coming out. That's like the only real thing. Dominator trash. I think it's like some of the only trash that you really need to know about, and by far the most important trash in the dungeon. First off, sick bats. Change Bigwigs or DBM right now to have an alert whenever you get sick bats cast on you. I've died a bunch of times during the PTR to that, so I would go ahead and change that right now. I think if you're doing this in a pug, I would recommend breaking this up into 2 pulls. Having your tank go grab some of the Dominators up from the landing and pull them down to this group where basically we're fighting it right now. And then the second group of Dominators, you're going to run all the way up into the Smash Bite room and then fight the Dominators there. This breaks the pull up into 2 pulls and it stops bats from spawning on the second pull. And basically the bats spawn until you enter this room. Now the Dominators, they require 1 melee interrupt to not enrage. More often than not, your tank can just kite away from the Dominators if the enrage gets stacked up too high though. That's kind of all you need to know about that trash. I would break it up into 2 packs. For Smash Bite, there's a 3-player soak rotation on the Hateful Charge. The tank can also dodge it, so things like Elusive Brawler is pretty OP. Making sure that you drop lines to the outside is like the only other thing that you really need to know about this boss. And then Kurtalis Ravencrest. I would try to push the first boss fast to not stack the tank bleed too high. The tank can actually be in a lot of danger if he isn't popping enough defensives or if the boss doesn't get pushed super fast. You need to make sure you pop major defensives for the first Shadow Bolt volley of the fight and prioritize down killing the swarms whenever those are coming out. The swarms do a ton of damage and have a lot of HP, so making sure that you actually kill those in time is pretty important. The only other thing is like you either lust on pull of that boss or after the first down phase during P2. So next up, we have Atal'Dazar. So there's a starting decision as to whether or not you go left or right. A lot of high-end groups will probably end up going left at the start. I think pugs are probably going to end up going right. There's a little bit of a different decision as to like what mobs you're going to face and like where your groups are going to be going. I think that a lot of groups are going to be going to that pull 2 that you have marked right there. The mobs that are the most important in this dungeon, though, are the honor guards, the witch doctors, the shield bearers, and the juggernauts. The honor guards do like they have a totem and they do an AoE cast once you kill the totem. The witch doctor has a hex and like bolt kicks. The shield bearers have an AoE stop, like the Bulwark of Juju is the name of that cast, and the juggernauts charge the furthest player. Or actually, no, they charge a player at ranged, but you can bait who they're on if you play into melee. It's not necessarily a ranged player, it's just players at ranged. The only other mobs that you really need to know about are the Sards and the Skyscreamers. The Sards are present a ton in this dungeon. They leap onto players. They do an AoE whenever they leap on top of players, and then the Skyscreamers just require 1 melee interrupt. That's pretty much all of the mobs in the dungeon, and the only things that you actually need to know about how the mobs work. For bosses, we have Volkal. I mean, you kill totems, and then you like try to DPS down the boss. The boss used to actually do a significant amount of damage to himself. That is since not looking to be the case now. He does some damage to himself, but it's not just like a ton. The best way of dealing with this fight is making sure that you like lust to this phase whenever he's active, because bloodlusting on the totems is kind of troll, and then kind of trying to stay stacked as possible, bait the puddles not in front of your group. You can play ranged on this fight and bait the puddles into the middle of the room, but like your melee group and your tank is going to be walking around the outside, because if you walk around the outside perfectly, not only are you going to have a lot more space, but eventually the puddles do despawn, and say the fight goes on for a really long time, you'll have like perfect space management if you do that well. Razan, rotation boss, where you rotate through the tank bleed, the boss sphere, and the pursuit. Not overly complicated. You can use things such as like Shadow Meld and Feign Death to be able to remove the pursuit off of your player. But in general, this boss is very, very straightforward. Not too many mechanics. Priestess Alunza kills herself. If you played back in BFA, it's basically the same thing. The only real mechanic on this boss is like Spirit of Gold, where you need to either make sure that you are killing the ads or you root them or CC them, like we have done right here. Things such as paralysis, banish, entangling root, all very good for dealing with that boss. You need to jump in the transfusion, the blood puddles whenever the transfusion cast happens, though. And that's kind of it. For Yasma, you need to make sure that you're dropping the ads in a good spot. Yasma, you'll just have the tank kick the boss, and the DPS and the healer will get like these soul rend reflections on themselves that walk towards the boss. If you utilize a slow and then you have like a decent amount of DPS to kill off the ads, you'll be in good shape. Every so often, the spiders go into like an active phase where they'll try to run you down, like you see on screen here. Don't get hit by them. That will be a really bad idea. You'll basically get 100 to 0'd if you actually get hit by the spiders. Okay, so next up, Throne of the Tides. Throne of the Tides beginning has a lot of the same type of trash mobs as you're going to see throughout the whole entire dungeon. Knowing probably the most important ones are going to be crucial for success. I would say that slow pulling the beginning of the dungeon is also important, as the double sentinel cast is pretty sketchy. But I think that the most important thing is like knowing what the mobs themselves do. And I would, again, like you see on screen there, I would break that pull up into 2 separate packs. First mob of the Ravagers. They're like, I would describe them as mini boss style mobs. They do a frontal and a ground effect. Just make sure that you don't stand in front of the boss, because it does a barrage style ability. The other mobs that you need to know are the Oracles, the Witches, and the Snapdragons. The Oracles have a heal cast, like a healing wave, and then a bolt. They probably should be stopped on the heal and then kicked on the bolt. The Witch does a damage circle. The damage circle is it's not really that relevant, honestly, and I don't think you really need to know what these mobs do. Just make sure they don't stack on top of other players with that. The Snapdragons, I'm going to actually pause right now because I need a bit more time to talk about this. The Snapdragons fixate players and are probably the hardest mobs in the whole entire dungeon. They do like a pursuit cast and they stack up a bleed. Evoker is very good for bleed removal, particularly on your tank from these mobs. And then making sure that you, like, if you get charged by the Snapdragons when they do the pursuit on you, making sure that you are not getting meleeed by them is super important. They do not recast. Like, if you CC them while they have the pursuit on you, they will, like, not break their pursuit at all. So CCing them is, like, almost whatever in a lot of instances. But those mobs suck. So knowing how to deal with them is important. Lady Najatar, a bit weird. Focus Tempest looks like it's a Chain Lightning style mechanic, but don't be fooled. It's actually just an AoE that bounces. So you kind of want to like stack up under the boss for your healer to be able to like top you up, especially for healers such as, you know, Resto Shaman or Disc Priest or whatever that want you to, Holy Paladin even, that want you to be a little bit closer for better healing. So making sure that you like stay stacked up, utilize things such as like Barrier and Darkness for those AoE effects is nice. And then you kill off ads during the intermission, like the Witches do like a Frostbolt cast on your tank. You can interrupt that. Try to get the mobs stacked up as fast as possible. And like once you kill off those mobs, you go back into the main phase, but it's not that big of a deal. Second boss, Commander Ulthok. He doesn't really do anything. He summons like puddles on the ground occasionally, and then those puddles summon blobs. The blobs get knocked back by like damage events. So, you know, like tanks and healers can actually do a lot of work by trying to knock these mobs back. You can also like throw dots on them as well to knock them back like one time. But more often than not, like the only thing that you need to know is that boss also does like a shockwave cast that puts a pretty steep dot on you. It's currently LOSable, but like at the end of the day, making sure that your healer is able to keep people topped up or making sure that you get knocked into a good direction is important. Third boss literally is just kill the totem. It's totem kill simulator. At 25% on this boss, the squid hops off the main boss and you have to LOS the fear every so often. But this boss is so fake. Like if you have enough damage to kill every single totem, and make sure that you have like dispels for the flame shock that goes out into people, you are big chillin'. Like this boss does not do a ton, like in all reality. So there's a reminder, like the trash in the dungeon is a bit whatever, but the trash at the very end is actually kind of important. The Sentry Water Elemental has a swell cast, and the swell cast is purgeable. Basically the deal is it does shadow damage AoE, and whenever you kill these corruptions that are near the mobs, it puts like a debuff on you that makes you take increased shadow damage. So making sure that you have a purge in this dungeon, and maybe even like a spammable one, is actually kind of important because there's a pack that has double sentry in it. So even things like double Demon Hunter is enough. You know, like Fell Hunter Purge, Hunter Purge, it's fine. Having a spammable purge is also nice. So you need to make sure that you have some purges in this dungeon to be able to stop that swell cast, because whenever you have that debuff, it's like pretty dangerous. Last boss is like just a clean the room check and pug killer. The Blotting Barrage and the ads that you kill drop puddles. Occasionally you get the suck lines, which pulse and clear the puddles on the ground. The puddles over time, and if you ever fall behind and don't perfectly clear these puddles, you can actually lose the fight and you lose like a lot of space on the boss. And so that's why it's kind of like a pug killer. You need to be super aware about just like clearing the room and doing kind of what we're doing in this video, where we're able to get all of that gunk cleared up fast. Okay, so now to Everbloom. Everbloom, I would say the trash is largely whatever, and it's not overly complicated. The Dread Petals are a large majority of your count, and the first pull of Everbloom is typically pretty large. Make sure that you get the Naturalist stacked up and they're not casting like Choking Vines on players. If you have the Naturalist cast going off and like the Vines cast going off onto players, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. But typically people will like double or triple up on this first pack. It's mostly fine. It's like, especially if you have your offensive CDs. Witherbark is actually a pretty interesting fight. He has two phases. First phase, wherever you spawn the vines around the boss, he's not really doing much aside from hitting the tank. Then he goes into 100% increased damage taken vulnerability phase, where the orbs around the room will walk towards the boss, and he like becomes like this brittle bark phase. And the orbs can either be 1 DPS down, 2 they can contact the vines that you see on the ground right here, or 3 they'll contact the boss, giving him 25% energy, and once he reaches like 100% energy, then he'll come out of his phase. You need to balance killing the ads versus just hitting the boss with your CDs, and it's kind of like a group by group decision. There's also like a question as to whether or not you have lust or not. If you have like a lot of ranged or dot classes, you likely can extend the phase for a while, whereas if you have a bunch of melee, you probably just hit the boss, and it really just kind of depends. Like in this group that you see like on screen, I'm playing Moonkin, so me, like I'm getting buffed by the Augurvoker, so we're hitting a lot of the orbs. But like if you have a bunch of melee, you're just gonna be hitting the boss in the 100% vulnerability phase, and you're just gonna get multiple phases. It is what it is. You're just not gonna extend it too long. Ancient Protector is pretty annoying boss for melee, but pretty chill for ranged. You kick the main casts on the bosses, which are the Revitalize and the Toxic Bloom. These casts are on like a 20-second rotation. Kicking the bolt cast, like Toxic Bolt and Water Bolt, whatever, it's a little bit of group damage, like group-wide damage reduction. But the tank needs to make sure that the big boy charges in like a good direction, and players need to watch out for ground effects that are spawning off of this. Typically, you want to be targeting the large ad. He has 50% more HP than the small ads. And while the small ads are a large portion of the difficulty of this fight, it's not going to speed up your dungeon a lot. So cleaving off the big guy is definitely going to be preferred. Only trash that matters in the dungeon is right here. And so the trash in front of Soul should be dealt with in a very specific way, since it's 3 casters that cannot be stopped. And the way you deal with this is as follows. You always kick the arcane mob. This will be a 2 melee rotation. You always kick the fire. This will also be a 2 melee rotation. And then you let the frost go off and personal the bolts that are on you. If you get a frost bolt that's during the AoE fire cast, which is named like Salvo, then you're in trouble. Because that fire guy does like a pretty massive AoE ability. But making sure that you have like double kick on the Ice Crawler, or the Arcanomancer, double kick on the Pyromancer, that is going to be the best way of being successful in this pack, because those mobs will actually one-shot you, where for some reason the Ice Crawler actually doesn't one-hit you with the Frost Bolts. You just need to make sure that you're personally know. This pack is hard. I think that lusting it's like pretty reasonable. I've lusted it a lot. But making sure you have offensive CDs is nearly mandatory. If we're talking about lusting it, you have to have offensive cooldowns. So next up we got Soul, which is basically the trash mechanics, where she does the fire AoE, the frost ground effects, and then throws out this arcane bomb that sucks players in unranged. Where the ranged players are the only people who are eligible to get it. The boss is supposed to rotate and add a new mechanic every so often, stacking the previous phases of mechanic with the new phases of mechanic, giving them 2 of you at one time. Sometimes I've seen it be a bit buggy where it'll give you the same one over and over again. But I would watch like what buffs she has for a more reliable indication of like what you're going to be getting. Like you saw there, we had Arcane plus Frost, where you need to make sure that you weren't going to get pulled into the popsicle balls and turn into a popsicle. Now we have the Arcane Orb plus the fire, and we need to make sure that you're not dragged into the fire, because getting dragged into the fire actually does a lot of damage. And so making sure that you like are pretty aware and just like have a nice understanding of what's going to be coming next is important. Whenever she is doing the fire AoE, it's kind of similar to the Salvo, where it's like a large amount of AoE. And so like personaling one and then your healer using a major healing CD on the second one, whenever you get back-to-back fire is important, because like you'll see right here, you're dropped pretty low and it's like intense healing on the move, which most healers are pretty bad at. Yanlu, final boss of the dungeon. It's a boss that's just about killing the ads every single time they spawn. The ads put a beam on the boss, making him take 300% increased damage, and so making sure that you kill them is important. If that was not enough, the ads also do like an AoE ability, which whenever it's comboed by ambient damage of his stomp, it's pretty deadly, so making sure that you pop a personal there is mandatory. Like look at how much damage we're taking from the stomp here, and if you also have that ad out at the exact same time, you can drop pretty low. So personaling whenever he's doing those 2 things in conjunction is important. Beyond that, it's just making sure that you stomp on the lashes whenever he's doing the revitalized cast. I've seen some healers kind of solo it. At the end of the day, like the ads don't really do a ton. I think if as long as you give like an honest effort at like stomping on them, it's mostly okay. Those little lashes really don't do a ton. So if you kind of want to continue to cast as a ranged DPS, it's more likely than not okay. But you need to, I would say, give like an honest effort. If you step on like 2 or 3 of them, you're kind of okay. Or you could just be like me here and be standing in melee and not doing anything. It's fine. All right. Darkheart Thicket's next. And the beginning of Darkheart Thicket, the trash matters the most are the bears, the cats, and the spiders. Those are probably the most important mobs at the first half of the dungeon. The bears do a stacking debuff on players that make them take more damage from subsequent casts. This is actually very deadly if you're stacked high enough. I'm thinking like 3 or 4. And double bear pulls, I think, are actually very dangerous. Like the ones that front of the first boss is a very, very dangerous pack. Cats have a Grievous style dot where they leap on you and they do like immediate physical damage, and then once you heal the player above 90% HP, then that dot is removed. The spiders are the main poison check of the dungeon. They put a circle on you that whenever it expires does damage. The downside is that the spiders, though, is if the circle goes off, you might get 100 to 0'd if you don't have a large personal pressed. So having a poison dispel for those spiders is what you actually should be looking for. First boss has 3 main mechanics. Grievous Leap, which is very similar to the Night Stalker cats we discussed earlier. He leaps on the farthest target, which is not similar to the cats, but like he leaps on the farthest target, dealing physical damage and putting a dot on them that requires them to be healed above 90% HP. He also does a charge on the tank whenever he converts to like a bear form. The tank typically wants to tank the boss on like these pillars that you see right here. We're using like these runes that are planted in the ground. That makes the boss not like charge super far, or potentially even like reset if he like charges up against the wall. Nightfall summons adds occasionally. You can pre-move the damage from the Nightfall ground effect if you want. It's not like super high. It's not like a huge deal, but it's like you do take some incidental damage. If you pre-move it, you can avoid taking any damage from it. The A-bombs will spawn on you. But like, if you focus on those mechanics, if you focus on like the bear charge and getting people topped up from the cat leap, you're going to be more or less fine. Next is some trash mobs. Keepers and Dryads. The Keepers heal the Blossoms. Dryads and Keepers are more annoying than deadly, is what I would say about these mobs generally. The Dryads do like a poison that is on some players. If you have a poison dispel for this dungeon, which you should, it's pretty trivial. Making sure that you focus down the Keepers to allow the Blossoms to be killed off is actually pretty important. The Blossoms are a large portion of your count of this key, so getting as many of them as possible is pretty nice. Oakheart, noob tank check. He summons roots occasionally that can be freedomed off or shapeshifted or, whatever, Tiger's Lusted, that kind of thing. Stacking is the ideal situation for this mechanic as it allows you to easily remove the roots, and knowing the cadence of like the stomp into the root mechanic is important because whenever you take the root, it does some like immediate damage. The stomp does like a massive amount of group-wide damage, especially at high end. And then the Nightmare Grip, or Nightmare Breath and Crushing Grip are the most important mechanics on this boss though, since they smoke your tank. Crushing Grip will also, like, whenever he picks up the tank, he does like 6 ticks of damage, but whenever he picks them up, he takes them off the ground, and so things such as barrier, consecration, darkness are not able to really be used on the tank, and so those are not effective DRs versus it. You need to be making sure that you are popping like major personal cooldowns. Immunities actually don't work, like bubble, his grip goes through bubble, so be very cautious with the tank check there, and make sure that you just like honestly pretty aggressively utilize externals on the boss. Drossaron is a 2-mechanic boss with Downdraft and Earth-Shaking Roar. You stand in the center of the hitbox for the Downdraft to not get easily pushed into the whelps. Like, if you stand like dead center of the boss, you actually don't move at all. And so that's definitely something that you should be looking to do, especially as like a caster, because it allows you to get a lot more casts on the boss. Earth-Shaking Roar is just an AoE that drops a ground mechanic. The boss also does a breath that the tank needs to watch out for. And melee DPS need to be watching out for. I think the breath is on the nearest player, so it's easy to be baited, but you need to really be paying attention on who it's going to be baited on, because it's not just the tank, it's on the nearest player. Xavius, 3-mechanic boss. So Drossaron was only a 2-mechanic boss, but Xavius is a 3-mechanic boss. Nightmare Bolt, Growing Paranoia, and Feed on the Weak. Nightmare Bolt is like large initial damage, and then a silence zone around you that requires you to be stacked to not be silenced. Growing Paranoia, I would describe it as like the opposite of the Nightmare Bolt, where if players are on top of you, then you get feared. And then if you can actually get both the bolt and the fear at the same time for some reason. And that's a pretty annoying combo. A lot of people will just instantly break the fear and just eat the fear. It sucks. As opposed to standing there silenced for 8 seconds waiting for the Nightmare Bolt to fade off of you. Feed on the Weak is like a high damage intake over time effect, where typically you want to personal it, and your healer wants to be healing the person who is actively getting targeted by Feed on the Weak. Waycrest Manor, I would say the trash on Waycrest is largely whatever. There are some mob themes near the Raw area that we're going to discuss later, but by and large, I think the trash is mostly telegraphed. Like, mechanics have a cleave that's named Cleave. The Soul Charmers have a volley that's named Volley you need to kick. Move the mobs out of the candles. I think that the mobs in here telegraph pretty well, so we're not going to discuss the trash like too in depth. Let's talk about bosses though. Heartsbane Triad, it was probably the hardest boss in this dungeon. It's been nerfed a decent amount, but it's still pretty dangerous. It's a council boss where you fight one boss at a time. All the bosses cast a bolt style mechanic ability that gets empowered whenever they're holding the iris, making the kicking on the active boss a much bigger deal. Selena is active first, and she does like a healing reduction and a mind control style effect. You make sure that you stun the person who has the MC, and if they're like a demon hunter, make sure that you Chaos Nova in advance, because if you Chaos Nova your whole entire group, you're probably going to lose. You want to hit the MC targets ASAP and get them to 50% HP to break them out. Malady, whenever she's active, she has like a stacking damage effect whenever you need to move, and then a curse that goes out. Briar has an ability called Nettles, which is similar to like Grievous, where it needs to be healed above 90% HP to remove it. It's also physical, so you can bop it off. It's not that big of a deal though. Like, you need to make sure that it's healed up before you go back into Selena though, because she has that healing reduction. So that's kind of the big deal with the Nettles, is that it just needs to be healed up before you reach that point. Of Courtyard area, again, mostly whatever kind of I was talking about with the trash earlier, but the mobs from the courtyard area are affected by the fire on the ground, and it does a little bit of damage to them. So it does like percentage-based HP to them. So actually tanking mobs, and particularly that mini boss into those mobs is actually a pretty big deal. Soulbound Goliath, I think, is probably the hardest boss in this dungeon now. His auto attack stack a buff on himself, making subsequent auto attacks do more damage. The way you reset this is by taking the boss into the fire. The only other mechanic is the Soul Thorns, which is a lot harder than it was back in BFA. The Soul Thorns have a ton of HP and require pretty intense target swapping. Making sure that you, like, if you're going to reset the boss on like his stacks, making sure that you reset him not whenever the Soul Thorns are coming out is actually really important. Otherwise, you're going to die. You're probably going to have somebody stuck in the Soul Thorns and die. But I think the big deal is, like, as long as everybody is trying to hit the person who is targeted with the Soul Thorns every single time, you should be in okay shape. Next up, we have the Raw Hallway, which I would describe the Raw Hallway as having like mob themes. And the main themes for this are like the Gorgers, the Piglets, the Maggots, and the Servants, where the Gorgers do a leap and a bleed onto players. Piglets do tank damage with Stout Smack, and the Maggots do like an Infest cast, and the Servants do a Dinner Bell AoE silence. The only thing that like you really need to know on top of that is like the Maggots, not every Maggot does an Infest cast, only ones that have like a very specific buff. So you can kind of track that. It's actually kind of important that you don't let the Infest go off, because one, you lose count of the Infest, and two, they split into three. And so making sure that you don't let them infest is actually pretty crucial. For Rawl, fake boss, we're not really going to talk about it. He telegraphs his mechanics pretty well. Lord and Lady Waycrest trash, I guess we're going to talk about that because it's actually kind of hard. I would not double pull this. The Soul Charmers are by far the hardest mobs in this area. They do a volley and they do a bolt mechanic, and they also drop the candles on the ground. So you need to make sure that you have a bunch of interrupts. And so I think that splitting this pack up into two is going to have like a higher success rate generally. Lord and Lady Waycrest, kind of similar to Rawl, a bit of an easy encounter. I actually thought about not even talking about this one either. Lord Waycrest puts Virulent Pathogen on the people, which could be disease dispelled, but make sure that you get away from your group before dispelling it or letting it expire. Boss doesn't really do much aside from that. Finally, we have Gorak Tool, which he summons ads, which leap onto people and do AoE damage. They also have a Death Lens cast, which will stun players, which should be stopped using like stun style effects. Beyond that, once the ads die, you need to make sure that they get fire thrown on them to make sure they don't respawn. And you throw the fire only whenever the Dread Essence cast is coming out. You don't really throw it before because you're trying to make sure that you get the highest amount of these Slayers in the fire before the Dread Essence cast comes out. He also requires an interrupt, which you should likely assign 2 melee DPS to be interrupting this boss. People told me that you could do it with 1, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Okay, lastly, we have both of the Dawn of the Infinites. We're going to talk about Dawn Upper first. I think that trash generally in Dawn of the Infinites telegraphs pretty well. Most of what you saw during the Mega Dungeon is consistent with kind of what you should expect here. Again, like the beginning area, the only mob that matters is the big lizard that does the smoke bomb and the maiden that shoots the boomerang orb. Like, those are the only mobs that really matter in the beginning. So for Tyr, though, he has like a random hammer ability, he has an AoE soak, a non-soak circle, and then like a tank hit. He also goes into his intermission once his energy is depleted, summoning orbs around the room. The orb part is probably the most important part of the boss. The orbs give you haste per stack, stacking up to 5. So making sure that everybody gets all of these orbs every single time his energy hits 100%, that's going to be the most important part. The most important trash mobs, though, in this whole key are these dragons that you see on screen here. The Divergenists in particular do an AoE effect that is very scary, and they should be priored down. I mean, like, you can get hit by a frontal like you saw on screen, but in general, though, like the Diversionist AoE is going to be like the pretty, but by far the most important thing. Beyond that, Rift Mages activate portals that go towards Morchi and Battlefield. You need to kill all the Rift Mages to activate the portals, and so that has to happen before you're able to proceed. You also have to make sure that all of the rifts are open before you're able to even go to Morchi or Battlefield. There's no like, oh, we opened the portal to Morchi, we're going to go do that, and then we're going to come back later and then finish off this area. That's not how that works. Let's talk about Battlefield first, though. Battlefield beats up your tank hard. I think the big thing with this boss is baiting the shockwave not towards those yellow ads and killing them off is like a pretty big deal, because then he's going to get Thirst for Battle stacks. Bladestorm, very similarly, Also, you want to avoid getting Thirst for Battle stacks on the boss. The Bladestorm moves incredibly fast towards players, so having a movement speed effect is really nice for this boss. But again, don't kite it through the yellow mobs. Beyond those two things, making sure you're CCing the axe throw immediately as it spawns, as it puts a bleed on the players, that's like a pretty big deal. Morchi, 100% of this fight's just like time trap mechanic, like you see on screen here. She summons images of the players that run towards them. If they melee you, you're probably going to die. If you kite the ad into the time trap, it does like an AoE dot, and typically 3 of these at once is going to be deadly for your group. So you try to blow them up like one at a time if possible. You can CC these ads with things like, Hunter Trap, Polymorph, Mass Poly, Mass Root, Ring of Frost, that kind of thing, to keep the ads like CC'd. I expect actually to see like high-end groups fully CC these ads permanently and not have to deal with them at all. But in general, just making sure that you don't blow up a bunch of the traps at once. That's going to be like a pretty big deal. Don't get melee by the mobs either. Trash in front of the last boss, I think, is by far the hardest trash in the dungeon, where it's got like dragons inside of it. These got these slayers that are doing like a mass AoE, and the marauders that's also doing like a mass AoE. I think that there's actually merit into bloodlusting this trash. At minimum, you're going to need to pop like pretty strong offensive cooldowns and defensive cooldowns on this trash because of just like how much damage it's doing. Like the Infinite Fury cast pulses an insane amount of AoE, even at like pretty low levels onto players. So you need to really make sure that you are ready going into this trash pack. Deus is the final boss of Upper Dawn. I would describe him as a one mechanic boss, making sure that you have like a ranged assigned to do the Infinity Orb mechanic like you see on screen here. It's probably the most important thing. They only spawn on ranged, and if you have like 1 or 2 ranged, then they will only spawn on those players. And you see right here, I'm actually the only ranged here, so it's always spawning on me in one of the melee, and so I'm just going to be the person who's consistently doing it in this group. But like, I think that you need to kind of be aware of who it's going to be spawning on, who are the eligible targets, and what the prio is going to be for standing in it versus not. And not watching your timers is going to cause some things like you see on screen right there. Lastly, we got Dawn Lower, where most of your count from Galakron's Fall, which is also Dawn Lower, is going to be gotten at the very beginning of the dungeon. I've yet to miscount in this place. This place is so stupid. I always go way over count. The trash at the very beginning is quite easy. You can burn Lust in all offensive CDs, and it really trivializes the trash. Making sure that you just like kick Chronomelt. I mean, that's about it, right? Like there's some like tank damage mobs that have like matter, but more often than not, it's just Chronomelt. First boss, Chronocar, has 2 main mechanics. First mechanic, all 5 members get circles, and they drop sand on the ground for area denial. Second mechanic, 2 players get targeted with a leap from the boss. Whenever the leap occurs, it leaves a soak circle behind, and then he leaps to the second person. All the boss really does, and having tank / melee DPS soak the circles is pretty nice. It's going to consistently be like what you're going to see like most groups do. Second area of trash. All of this is required. The only trash mob that matters is the time stream anomaly. He does an ability called Bloom, where he marks a tank in a random player. Dispel the tank immediately whenever the bloom goes out, as it like shares damage. I want to say it's like the damage is converted that the tank is taking, and it puts like a dot on the player over 8 seconds. And so you need to make sure that you dispel the tank immediately and then heal that player that has that second part of that bloom, because you probably took like, a couple of melees whenever that was active. And so that can actually be pretty scary. Manifested Time Waste. It's changed a bit from 10.1 to 2.2. The tank frontal is removed, making this mostly a 2 mechanic boss. The boss is also a pretty big pug killer because of how easy it is to die to this fight. Fragments of Time, which is the mechanic that you're seeing on screen right here. It's probably the most important mechanic of the boss. The boss does orbs and then like spins them around the room. You want to stand as close to the boss as possible, and then just aggressively move counterclockwise to make sure that you're not going to be getting hit by any of these orbs. Getting hit by any of these orbs is probably going to have you die. If you get 1 stack, maybe you can live, but 2 stacks is like almost certainly a death sentence. The only other mechanic is Chronofaded, which you want to stand in like the fast zone, which is like that light color zone that you see on screen, whenever the mechanic is expired or is being dispelled off of you. And that's basically how the boss works. Just again, aggressively moving counterclockwise to the right around this boss is going to be pretty important. But a Galakron, 1 mechanic boss, you have the Hot Potato Corrosion cast that goes on to players. They have to like step on another player to pass it back and forth. It's like the tank +1, and that's typically like a melee player. This fight is boring. Capital B boring. Like there's nothing going on aside from the the hot potato mechanic. This not really much going on. It telegraphs pretty well. Iridicron. You need to make sure you stand on Chrome with the extinction event, making sure that like everybody gets out of the circle with that. And then with like the Stonecracker barrage, you put your tank in the front soak and then everybody else goes in the back soak. Your healer also must heal Chromie, otherwise you're going to wipe this. I've had healers not realize that they need to heal Chromie. Once you get the boss to 90%, he starts casting Cataclysmic Obliteration. You need to make sure that you have like a strong offensive cooldowns here, or potentially even less, to make sure the boss is going to hit 85%. If he doesn't hit 85% during this Cataclysmic Eruption cast, you're going to just wipe. But beyond that, though, that's the end of the dungeons. That's the end of this video. I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I will see you guys posting some YouTube videos soon, talking about some tips that you're going to see inside of all of the Season 2 or the Season 3 dungeons. And yeah, that's going to be it. Goodbye.